Hi and welcome to Edu Gurukul. So today we are going to start with the second chapter and this is from R. Sharma. Our basic material is again R. Sharma and NCRTs. So to begin with, modern historians of ancient India. So we have various approaches or perspectives, right? To read history or to write history. सबका अपना अपना perspective है which reflects and that is what we call as history. कुछ लोग बायस्ड होते हैं कुछ लोग अनबायस्ड होके लिखते हैं सो देर आर दीज वेरियस लेंसेज कहते हैं ना जैसा लेंस पहनो आपको दुनिया वैसा दिखना लगता है सो इन द सेम वे द काइंड ऑफ पर्सपेक्टिव यू स्टार्ट डेवलपिंग somehow it reflects in your various attributes in the conduct in the way you live your life and it is the same with the perspective of the historians. So as a social science, history is the study of past and it is mostly bias. It is mostly bias till some period of time. People still try to have an unbiased way to write history, and that is why we can see there is now a tendency to rewrite history. We are editing lot of things, we are coming up with new informations, with new research and development. So, पहले क्या था? There was this colonialist approach or the view and how they contributed in the development of history. So, why there was this urge of knowing about Indian people and to write about Indian people? So, when the Britishers came, right? So, basically, the research started in the second half of the 18th century. As you can see here it is mentioned. These PPTs are more than enough, my friends. Let me just tell you, आप इसको बार-बार revise करें. This you don't have to make separate notes. कुछ भी edit करना है, add करना है, you can do it here. But this is the best source for you. आप इसी से बार-बार revise करें. You will find, read the book as in the first lecture in the orientation class as sir mentioned that you just need to read it in a proper approach. Please follow that approach. Please watch the orientation video and you will get to know how to read and what is the correct way to read. And definitely it is going to help you a lot. Now getting back to this. So in the second half of the 18th century, it served, right? So history ka research started. And why it started? Basically it was for the administrative purpose. For better administration it started. ब्रिटिशर्स को समझ में नहीं आया कि व्हाट काइंड ऑफ पीपल आर दीज इंडियंस. अब मुझे यहाँ पे आप अगर एडमिनिस्टर करना चाहो, अगर आप इंडिया के लोगों को एडमिनिस्टर करना चाहो, यू नीड इंडियन वेज. यू कैन नॉट कम अप विद अ कॉलोनियल माइंड सेट विद जो आप बाहर ब्रिटिश में करते हो वो आप यहाँ पे आके अगर हमारे ऊपर लागू करें, वी विल नॉट अबाइड with the rules and regulations. You will see there is chaos in the society then. And the same happened. And that is why there was a urge for the Britishers to know about India, to read and to write about India, to know the history of India, and to administer these Indian peoples for better administration, right? As you can see here, there was a need to develop history of Indian people through a different lens, and that lens was of the colonialists. So what happened was the Hindu law of inheritance. Hindu law of inheritance, it was very difficult to administer in Bengal and Bihar under the East India Company rule in 1765. So we see that there was this administrative law book by Manu Smriti, right? It was by Manu, and it was translated in English as a code of Gentoo laws in 1776. So जैसे कि हमने कहा था, we will provide you with some extra information which is very relevant for your examination. So this was translated by whom? It was translated by Warren Hastings. Right? It was by Warren Hastings, and he was the Governor General of India. Right? So इससे related और एक information है, अगर हम ये देखें, इससे related there is a very important information again, my friends, that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar burned the Manusmriti during the Mahad Satyagraha in 1927, and that was called as Manusmriti Dahan Divas to protest against the religious ideals that advocated untouchability against the lower classes. So I will write it here that B.R. Ambedkar, right? B.R. Ambedkar burned the Manusmriti during Mahad Satyagraha. Fine. In the year 1927. And इसको क्या कहा गया? It was called as Manusmriti Dahan Divas. Because Manusmriti में लिखा गया था that untouchability है, and you know there were a lot of things which were against the lower caste people. So people started saying that ये तो गलत बात है, and that is why B.R. Ambedkar in the 1927 burned this book itself. But again, if we come back, what is the source of the code of these laws? ये जो source है, please mention it somewhere. In the notes, you can just mention it that the source was Vivada Bhangar Nava, right? It was Vivada. Prelims mein you can get these kind of questions, right? It becomes very important for you to know these small informations. These are data. आपको ये डेटा बहुत हेल्प करेगा. तो इसका सोर्स क्या था? कोड ऑफ जेंटू लॉज का सोर्स था विवाद भंगर नवा. फाइन. Then, so the Pandits who were associated with the British judges to administer the Hindu laws, Pandit जो थे वो Hindu civil laws के लिए थे, and Maulavis were there to administer the Muslim laws, right, with the help of the British judges. So इसके हिसाब से can you now get idea कि धीरे धीरे करके कैसे एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन को वो लोग स्ट्रॉन्ग करने लगे? Basically the colonialists. Now the efforts to understand ancient laws and customs started culminating, and it led to the establishment of Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, right? So देखो धीरे धीरे करके जब हम उनके customs को जानने लगे, the initial effort was basically to understand what? To understand the ancient laws, customs, right? And that continued, and then it culminated into the formation of this Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. These becomes very important things क्योंकि यहीं से आपको match the followings आ सकता है as questions in your prelims, right? And mains में भी आप लिख सकते हो कि कैसे अगर question आ गया आपको कभी भी that colonialist view जहाँ पे आपको लिखना होगा. So these things will make your approach very clear. So try to understand this very properly. So to understand the ancient laws and his customs, this culminated into the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. It was set up by whom? It was set up by Sir William Jones, who was a civil servant of East India Company. So the civil servant played very important role then also, as you can see, for the establishment of such kind of institutions, such kind of premier institutions. So Sir William Jones suggested what? He suggested that Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, they all belong to the same family. As I told you in the first lecture, her language ka you will find relevance with some other language because we all have amalgamated. The cultures have amalgamated, the language, it is all comminglement. The word was commingled. Key terms are very important for you to write in your answers क्योंकि ये जो की वर्ड्स होते हैं वही आपको अच्छा मार्क्स फेच करेंगे. So never forget the keywords, right? Now, so he again, Sir William Jones का contribution क्या था? First of all, it was Asiatic Society. So you can just see first contribution was Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1784. Second was he suggested that Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, they all belong to the same family. And third was he translated the play Abhijana Shakuntalam, right, into English, and Bhagavad Gita into English, right? So language played very important role then क्योंकि translation was also important. आप दूसरे language को नहीं समझ पा रहे हो, so we need to translate it and then give your perspective of India. So he translated Abhijana Shakuntalam and also Bhagavad Gita in English. Now you can see a very famous quote of William Jones: the Sanskrit language, whatever be it, antiquity, is of wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greeks, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. So you can see that it is more refined. William Jones want to say that Sanskrit is refined version, right? It is a very refined version. It is the best of the languages. Now we get to know that the Bombay Asiatic Society was also set up. So it was the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Now Bombay Asiatic Society was also there in 1804. And the Asiatic Society of the Great Britain was set up in London. In London, 1823. So they were setting up all of this for what? To understand India in a better way, to read and write, to research well about India for better administration. That was the view of setting up all of these institutions. So William Jones emphasized the similarity of European language to Sanskrit and the Iranian language also. So he kept emphasizing, William Jones he emphasized kar rahe the that there was a great relevance, right? There was a great relevance in the languages that he saw, and he kept saying that Sanskrit, Latin, Greek ka relevance hai, European language ka relevance hai with the Sanskrit and the Iranian languages. So he led to the fostering of Indological studies. So he was a torchbearer of Indological studies in Germany, France, and Russia. Now, various chairs were there on Sanskrit were established in the UK and European countries in the first half of the 19th century. देखो कितना रिसर्च चल रहा है इसमें, कितना इन डेप्थ धीरे धीरे ये जाने लगे संस्कृत को समझने के लिए. संस्कृत समझेंगे तभी तो वो इंडियन सोसाइटी को समझ पाएंगे, एंशियंट इंडियन सोसाइटी को समझ पाएंगे, टू बी मोर accurate. Then we see that Max Muller, this great person, he gave great impetus to the Indological studies, right? And it was largely based in England. So Indological studies अब various places में होने लगा. देखो जैसे कि first you see Indological studies कहाँ पे होने लगा, जैसे कि ये हुआ Germany. This is like Germany. Then we see France. Then we see Russia. And then we see Max Muller in England also started. And then you can see there was the Great Revolt of 1857, Sepoy Mutiny. Sepoy Mutiny. पहले इसको बोला जाता था that this is the great first war of independence, but now it is the Piker Rebellion, which is the first war of independence. But this plays a very important role, and it is still very important, right? And then we see that the revolt of 1857 made Britain realize the need of deeper knowledge, right? सो आपको डीपर नॉलेज नहीं था, तभी आपने गलत एडमिनिस्टर किया लोगों को, एंड देयर वाज great chaos in the society. People started revolting. So there was this great revolt of 1857, which made the Britain realize that we need to understand India in a better way. So the Christian missionaries sought to uncover the vulnerabilities in Hindu religion to win the converts and strengthen the British Empire. Right? They had to understand this in a better way. And the ancient scriptures were then translated on a massive scale under the editorship of Max Muller. Right? Max Muller के editorship में they started translating these massive scales. So the next thing is that we see the Sacred Books of the East series. They published 50 volumes with most of the texts with ancient Indian texts, and a few Chinese and Iranian texts were included. So sacred books को translate करने लगे, है ना? So we see that Max Muller played a very important role. We see Sir William Jones, Warren Hastings. See, Warren Hastings, right? He played a very important role. Then we saw Sir William Jones. He played a very important role. Then we see Max Muller. आप सबको इनके नाम अच्छे से याद रखने होंगे और आपको समझना होगा what were the contributions. So these people played very important role in the colonialist approach. You can see these books. There are these Vedas. These are the sacred books translated by Max Muller. See, Atharva Veda, right? Satapatha Brahmana. So these are the very important books. Now the Western scholars, including Max Muller, made generalizations about the ancient Indian history and society in introduction of their volumes and books. तो आप अगर जनरलाइज करने लगोगे, कहीं ना कहीं आपका सही नहीं होगा अप्रोच. यू नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड अ थिंग बिकॉज उसका खुद का भी तो एक पर्सपेक्टिव है. देयर इज अ डिफरेंट स्टोरी ऑल टुगेदर बिहाइंड. यू कैन नॉट कम अप एंड से दैट एवरीथिंग इज द सेम. यूनिवर्सलाइजेशन या जनरलाइजेशन नहीं कर सकते. एंड दे स्टेटेड दैट द एंशिएंट इंडियंस लैक्ड अ सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री. राइट? दे स्टार्टेड क्रिटिसाइजिंग इंडिया बिकॉज दे हैड टू एडमिनिस्टर इंडियन पीपल. तो वो ये तो नहीं लिख सकते इंडिया वॉज अ वेरी ब्यूटिफुल कंट्री, इट वॉज अ ग्रेट लैंड, इनका खुद का एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन था. वी हैड, इफ यू रीड प्रॉपरली हिस्ट्री को अगर आप अच्छे से पढ़े, वी हैड वेरी गुड इकोनॉमिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन, पॉलिटिकल एंड सोशल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन. बट स्लोली इट स्टार्टेड चेंजिंग. एंड हिस्टोरियंस अपने नज़रिए में ये लिख के गए कि इंडिया तो कभी अच्छा था ही नहीं. उन्होंने अच्छा बना के दिया हमें एक बेहतर इंडिया, और बेहतर एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन तो वो सिखा के गए हमें. राइट? सो दैट इज हाउ दे वांटेड टू चेंज द माइंड्स, द पर्सपेक्टिव्स ऑफ दोज हु रीड हिस्ट्री. So they said that India, ancient Indians, right? Ancient Indians, they always lacked a sense of history. They don't have a sense of history. ना हिस्ट्री का उनको कोई नॉलेज है, ना क्रोनोलॉजी का उनको कोई अता पता है. राइट? एंड दे वर accustomed टू द despotic रूल. राइट? तो दे सेड दैट ये तो बहुत गया गुजरा कंडीशन में है. ठीक है? एंड दे ऑलवेज सेड दैट इंडियंस वर सो एनग्रॉस्ड इन स्पिरिचुअल प्रॉब्लम्स. Indians are always engrossed in spiritual problems, and उनका कोई लेना देना नहीं है कि दुनिया में क्या problems चल रहा है. They are least concerned about दुनियादारी, rather they are only concerned about the spiritual problems. Look how they wrote about history. What kind of perspective they had, what kind of mindset they had. And the Western scholars stressed that India had no sense of nationhood or self-governance. They wrote all of this for us. कोई बाहर से आके हमारे बारे में इतना कुछ लिख के गए, and we just could not do anything. That this is the colonialist approach, right? जिसमें वो इंडिया के बारे में कुछ अच्छा लिखते ही नहीं थे mostly. And many of the generalization were made in the early history of India by Vincent Arthur Smith. So he's another one addition to all of them who worked and wrote about India. This was one more perspective, right? So he wrote that Vincent Arthur Smith, he also wrote about India in the same way. He generalized it. So Smith's book was based on the available sources and it gave primacy to the political history and served as a textbook for nearly 50 years. 50 years तक यही चलता रहा उनका. And then we see that Smith's approach to history was pro-imperialist. Again, pro-imperialist, and he emphasized the role of foreigners in the ancient India. Right? Moving on to the next, we see again a very good book of this. अभी जब मैं बात करी थी आर्थर स्मिथ के बारे में, ये उन्हीं की किताब है. And then we see that Alexander's invasion was there, which accounted for 1/3 of the book. Alexander के invasion के बारे में लिखा. India was depicted as a land of despotism. इसको बोल दिया गया, it was a land of despotism without the political unity until British came. So after Britishers came, we learned to be united. There was political unity. Otherwise, there was no political unity. The British interpretation of Indian history aimed to what? To always justify that the colonial rule was great. Always the colonial people helped us with everything and we didn't had anything before that. Right? And some observations had all of these validity because they kept on exaggerating these things. Right? It was all false. It was not true. इंडिया तो वैसे नहीं था जैसे ये दिखाना चाहते थे. Right? And they always emphasized that Indian tradition of one man rule justified the system with all the power in one hand, and that was of the viceroy. So the notion that Indians were obsessed with next world problems justified British colonial rule. And जब ये generalization बार बार होने लगा कि वहीं हमें आके we are incapable, right? The Indians were incapable of self governance. एक तो पहले उन्होंने कहा कि इनका self governance है ही नहीं. And then they say that ये तो govern कर ही नहीं पाएंगे खुद को. But today, can you see this man? The great man, Rishi Sunak, the Indian who is set to rule Britain. This is the wheel of, बोलते हैं ना समय का पहिया. So today you can see that he is ruling. He's going to rule Britain. Indian, right? Now, जब इतना कुछ बोल दिया तब what do you think? The nationalists चुप बैठते? Never, right? So they came up with a new approach that was a nationalist approach. They wanted to glorify India. They were not happy with the view and the perspective that Britishers wanted to have and prevail. So they came up with this. So the Indian scholars faced great challenge due to colonialist distortions, right? They always had this thought कि क्यों हम किसी और को हमारे बारे में लिखने दे और इतना लिख के जाएं वो कि लोग तो इंडियंस को ऐसे ही देखने लगेंगे फिर. So they started their own research and development, right? And a band of scholars, they took it as a very good mission to reform Indian society and reconstruct the ancient history to make a case like for the social reforms and self-government. So basically इनका क्या thought था? They were Hindu revivalist ideas were there and they adopted a rationalist approach. Nationalist का approach क्या था? Hindu revivalist ideas were there and they adopted a rationalist approach. So Rajendra Lal Mitra was there who belonged to the later category and he published the Vedic texts and he wrote a book entitled Indo-Aryans. Now the Mitra, this person, right? He had a very rational view. And he argued that people ate beef in the ancient times. देखो उसके अंदर भी there were lot of problems, right? ऐसा तो नहीं होगा कि किसी ने कोई आके easily कोई काम करके चले जाए, right? Again, he had his own thoughts क्या आप बोलते हो दैट हिंदू रिवाइवलिस्ट रखोगे और रैशनलिस्ट अप्रोच रखोगे इसमें? बट राजेंद्र लाल टोल्ड दैट इवन इन द एंशियंट सोसाइटीज पीपल एट बीफ एंड एंशियंट एंड दिस मीट एंड ऑल, जिसको हिंदू सोसाइटी एक्सेप्ट नहीं करती है, बट पीपल एट बीफ. So other scholars sought to prove that the caste system was not fundamentally different, right? Caste system was not fundamentally different, and you can see that right, fundamentally different from the class system, right? It was not different from the class system, which was based on division of labor, and it was also found in Europe's pre-industrial and ancient societies. तो आप ऐसे क्यों बोलते हो सिर्फ इंडिया में ये देखने को मिलता है, right? Why do you always say that it is only a Indian phenomenon? It is also seen in Europe, right? It is also seen in Europe. You can also, अगर कास्ट के बारे में आपको कहीं लिखने का मौका मिला, you can also write this, that other scholars, the nationalists, they wanted to, or they proved that the caste system was not fundamentally different from the class system based on division of labor, which was also found in Europe's pre-industrial and ancient societies, right? अगर similarity कहीं दिखाने को मिला. And this was the book by Rajendra Lal Mitra. Fine. This is the book. That is the contributions towards this book. You can just see. This is the book. Moving on to the next. We see that Ramakrishna Gopal Bhandarkar and Vishwanath Kashinath Rajwade. These are the two important names. You have to remember these names, right? R.G. Bhandarkar and Vishwanath Kashinath Rajwade. They emerged as two dedicated scholars of Indian social and political history. So R.G. Bhandarkar ने क्या? He reconstructed the political history of the Satavahanas of the Deccan and the history of Vaishnavism and other sects. So he reconstructed the political history, and he was a great social reformer, right? So he advocated for the widow remarriage, and he always criticized the evils of caste system and child marriage. What are the contributions of Bhandarkar? These are the contributions of Ramakrishna Gopal Bhandarkar. First of all, he reconstructed the political history of Satavahanas of the Deccan. He was the one who wrote wrote the history of Vaishnavism and other sects. He was against the evils of caste system and child marriage, and he advocated widow remarriage. Now, this Vishwanath Kashinath Rajwade, what was his contribution? His contribution was he was in a journey for a search of Sanskrit manuscripts or the source of Maratha history. So he was in a search for Maratha history, and he published 22 volumes, right? Which was eventually जो उन्होंने research किया वो 22 volumes में publish किया उन्होंने. And the history of the institutions of marriage will continue to be a classic one. So the history of the institution of marriage is going to be always the best one of his writings. So then we see that Panduranga Vaman Kane, a great Sanskritist and social reformer, he continued the tradition of scholarship. So you have to remember all of these names, my friend, and what were the contributions. In brief, आपको याद रखना होगा, इतना नहीं है कि you have to go into like too in depth and remember all of this, but just मोटा मोटी आपको याद रखना है that Panduranga Vaman Kane, he was the one who continued the tradition of scholarship, right? In the monumental work, what was his work? You have to remember history of Dharma Shastra, right? History of Dharma Shastra, and the history of Dharma Shastra is the encyclopedia. It is the encyclopedia of ancient social laws and customs. So which helps us to understand the social processes in ancient India. Fine. So अगर social processes के बारे में लिखना हो कभी भी, you can also quote all of these. कहीं पे ये book के बारे में आप mention ज़रूर कर सकते हैं. These are the books. History of Dharma Shastra, 5 volumes in 8 books. Right? It is a very rare book. So the Indian scholars studied polity and political history to demonstrate the existence of Indian political history and expertise in administration. the Indians, जब हम बोलते हैं nationalist view, they wanted to always justify their stand. करना भी चाहिए ज़रूर. Because as I told you, we had very good system of administration in the ancient times. In various dynasties we have seen some or the other dynasty was very strong and very good in some or the other sphere, be it political, social, economical, health, and whatnot. We see Charak, we see lot of good things. We see the Dharma Shastra, Artha Shastra, and whatnot, right? Kautilya. And we have great books, we have great research persons also in the past. So what made the Britishers tell us that we are inferior? And this was the lens or the view of the nationalists. So we see that Devdutt Ramakrishna Bhandarkar was there. He published a book on Ashoka and ancient Indian political institutions. Then we see that there was Hemchandra Rai Chaudhary. He reconstructed history of ancient India from 10th century BC to the end of the Gupta Empire to justify that we were equally good. We were equally good in administration and uh, to have a very good Indian political history. We had expertise in administration also. They wanted to justify all of this. So they adopted methods and comparative insights from teaching European history. Now, did not discuss about the periodization, right? So they didn't have this periodization thing. They recognized the contributions of V.A. Smith, just like we read, but they criticized him also. थोड़ी देर पहले हमने देखा था that his book. So they recognized this book, but they criticized this, right? And the writings marked by the impeccable scholarships, but with a streak of militant Brahminization, right? Streak of militant Brahminization and criticism of Ashoka's policy of peace, right? So R.C. Majumdar was a prolific writer. He had come up with the multiple volumes of history and culture of Indian people with a strong element of Hindu revivalism in his writing. So, Hindu revivalism के बारे में लिख रहे हो, you can definitely write his book. You can mention about his book that R.C. Majumdar was there. His book was having multiple volumes and it was mostly about the Hindu revivalism. The book's name is History and Culture of Indian People. सो बेसिकली इसमें इस चैप्टर से आपको क्या करना है, पहले तो आपको समझना है व्हाट इज द पर्सपेक्टिव, और दूसरा आपको ये याद रखना है किसने कौन सा बुक लिखा था, ठीक है, और बुक में क्या था. बेसिकली आपको इतना ही जानना है. तो आप देख सकते हो दीज आर द बुक्स. अगेन व्हेन यू हैव अ विजुअल थिंग, राइट, अब आप अगर एक बार एक बुक को विजुअली देख लो तो आपको बेटर अंडरस्टैंडिंग होता है और बेटर याद भी रहता है. So that is why we have given you all of these pictures, है ना, to have a better understanding that okay these were the books. एक visually आपको याद रह जाएगा कि okay इसमें इस सब के बारे में mention था. Now the most early Indian history writers they ignored the South Indian thing. वो South India को completely और mostly ignore कर दिए. So K.A. नीलकंठ शास्त्री, right, नीलकंठ शास्त्री, he was a historian from South India, right? And he had the same approach. He followed the same approach in his history of ancient India. So Shastri's history of South India rectified the lack of attention. So जब attention ना दिया जाए तब उसको भी उन्होंने rectify किया by giving attention to South India. Right? It was very lucid and he written very beautifully presenting the various facts. Shastri's general observations on polity and society in South India had been questioned by the scholars. So Shastri emphasized the cultural supremacy of the Brahmanas. He questioned and he emphasized the cultural supremacy of the Brahmanas and the harmony in early Indian society. Now, under Shastri's leadership, research monographs were produced. Research monographs were produced and that too on a dynastic history of South India. तो अब हम South India के बारे में भी जानने लगे with a nationalist approach. Nothing was to be left out. So until 1960s, Indian scholars focused primarily on the political history. अब तक हम क्या करते थे? We were just writing about the political history. We just wanted to glorify the dynasties and to show that okay, we are better in the administration, in the political history. So basically it was somehow हम holistically हिस्ट्री को नहीं पढ़ते थे तब. The nationalists, they focus basically on the political history, right? And how to better administer, what was the administration, and all of that. So V.A. Smith's book devoted a large portion of Alexander's invasion while Indian scholars gave it less importance. ये भी और एक dialectical thought हम देखने को we get to see here. Emphasis was placed on the dialogue of Porus with Alexander and Chandragupta's liberation of northwest India. Right? This is important. You have to remember that there was a dialogue of Porus with Alexander and Chandragupta Maurya, right, for deliberation of northwestern India. The scholars such as K.P. Jayashwal and A.S. Altekar, they overplayed the role of indigenous dynasties in liberating India. Right? तो उन्होंने कहा कि इनका भी रोल है इसमें. It was K.P. Jaiswal and A.S. Altekar. Now, little realization was there that Central Asians became an intrinsic part of India. Central Asia भी एक important part है India का. And they did not exploit resource for their homeland. Right? So K.P. Jaiswal's greatest merit was dispelling the myth of Indian despotism. He said that ये इसको तो dispel करना ही है, that the myth that people have that Indians were under despotic rule. And he kept writing about the republics. So he kept writing about the republics in of the republics in ancient India with self-government. And we have seen that the findings were published in 1924 in the book Hindu Polity. But again, he is criticized. Jaiswal was criticized for projecting modern nationalists' idea into ancient institutions. People were saying that ये तो modern thought है, ये तो modern ideologies है, ये ancient institutions में कैसे था? But he has proved it in his books. So his work has been attacked by the writer. अब इसको attack कौन किया? That was U.N. Ghoshal. Right? U.N. Ghoshal said that how can you place all the modern thoughts in ancient institutions? And Hindu Polity considered a classic till now in its 6th edition. Then we see that we move towards the non-political history. So हमने देखा colonialist approach, then we saw the nationalist approach. Now we are proceeding towards the non-political history. In non-political history, what do we see? It is basically by A.L. Bhasham, who was a British historian and Sanskritist. So he questioned that the wisdom of looking at ancient India from a modern perspective. हम क्वेश्चन किए, जहां पे देखिए आप एक फेज को छोड़ रहे हैं, अब उसी से ही वी आर मूविंग टू द अनदर फेज. सो हियर यू कैन सी दैट एंशिएंट इंडियंस फ्रॉम अ modern perspective he wanted to see, he questioned that. So initially he had a deep interest in the materialist philosophy of heterodox sects. Later he believed that the past should be read for curiosity and pleasure. So his book was, you can see this man's book was this. Match the following में ये आ सकता है. A.L. Bhasham, The Wonder That Was India. It is a survey of ancient Indian culture and civilization. What the book is about? It is about the survey of ancient Indian culture and civilization. So it is free from prejudice. तो हम देखते हैं ये नॉन पॉलिटिकल हिस्ट्री जो है, इट इज फ्री फ्रॉम प्रेजुडिस बेसिकली. राइट, दिस इज द बुक द वंडर दैट वाज इंडिया. इसके ऊपर बहुत बार क्वेश्चन भी आया है इन प्रीलिम्स. सो यू जस्ट नीड टू नो अबाउट द बुक्स, व्हाट इट इज अबाउट एंड हु वाज द राइटर और द ऑथर. आपको कितने वॉल्यूम्स में आए वो नहीं पूछ सकते हैं, अभी तक नहीं पूछा गया हाउ मेनी वॉल्यूम्स. सो जो रेलिवेंट डेटा है आपको वो याद रखना है. सो Basham's books was a shift from political to non-political history. This is very important my friends. Writing में कैसे चेंज होने लगा? It was from political to non-political history, and the same shift we can see in dd kosambi's book, An Introduction to the Study of Indian History. We see that there was the same relevance कि वो पॉलिटिकल से नॉन पॉलिटिकल हम कैसे शिफ्ट कर रहे हैं उसके बारे में था. So Kosambi presented history of ancient India and the economy and the culture as a part of forces and relations of production. So Kosambi wrote it about this कि forces and relations of production के साथ कैसे society, economy और culture का change होता है. So again they started following the materialist interpretation of history which was derived from Karl Marx. So आप अगर sociology का पेपर लिख रहे हो, ये सब आपके लिए बहुत important है. अगर आप सोसाइटी के बारे में भी लिख रहे हो, then this information is very important for you. You can write about it. So the first survey volume to show stages of social economic development in terms of tribal and class processes. So they criticized it, and again it was criticized by many scholars, but it is still continued to be read widely. Like this book you can see by D.D. Kosambi, The Culture and Civilization of Ancient India in Historical Outline. Now we will see that what were the changes. We saw colonialist view, we saw nationalist view, जो उसको काउंटर करने के लिए बना. फिर हम देखते हैं वहीं से ही थॉट लेके द नॉन पॉलिटिकल हिस्ट्री, राइट. सो वी सी दैट द चेंज इन मेथड्स क्या क्या था इन द फ्रॉम व्हेन देयर वाज अ चेंज इन द नॉन पॉलिटिकल हिस्ट्री. व्हाट वेयर द चेंजेस. अब पॉलिटिको हम इतना इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं देंगे. वी विल गिव मोर एम्फसाइज और एम्फोसिस टू सोशल, इकोनॉमिक एंड कल्चरल प्रोसेसेस. सो इसमें क्या था? There was a change in method and orientation to study ancient history. We started focusing on, as I said, these three aspects. Then we see that the relations to political developments, we are not focusing on the political development per se, but the relations, right? Then we see that there was a stratification. है ना? We see stratification was there, good future for historical studies. And then we see that there was this Western writers were no longer insist all cultural elements came from outside, right? They emphasized that religious ideas, rituals, caste, kinship, traditions were central forces. अब उन्होंने ये नहीं कहा कि अच्छा ये बाहर से आया. They just said that it was all there in ancient times, right? Just like this. Fine. Now, so they were mostly concerned about, or they were concerned with the problems of stability. They were concerned about the problems of stability and continuity. तो कितने स्टेबल और कितना हम कंटिन्यू कर रहे हैं प्रीवियस चीज़ों को, अभी तक हम आगे लेके जा रहे हैं. जस्ट लाइक वी से दैट देयर इज कंटिन्यूटी एंड कंटिन्यूम जैसे बोला जाता है, राइट. So they were fascinated with the old exotic elements and the desire to preserve them. These Western writers, they started doing all of this. So there was stagnation as an integral part of Indian character, right? And they implied that Indian society has not changed and cannot be changed. So they kept saying that it cannot be changed. तो अभी भी इनका interpretation कुछ ज़्यादा अच्छा नहीं था हमारी तरफ. So we see that some Indian writers magnifying roles of religion and believe everything good and great originated in their country. तो जहाँ हम देखते हैं there are two dialectical view. एक और हम देखते हैं India and the Indian writers they are trying to glorify the history and the non-political history also. In the same time we see the Western writers वो ना पॉलिटी में हमें अच्छा बोलते थे और ना ही हमें वो सोशल, इकोनॉमिकल एंड कल्चरल प्रोसेस में उतना अच्छा मानते थे. They were just glorifying us with the exotic elements of the old things that were there. They just wanted to preserve those things, but basically they kept saying that इसमें तो caste है, kinship है, tradition है, यही सब है. That is the central force of Indian society, right? So they just started writing about India. They said ये सब बाहर से नहीं आया है, ये सब Indian characteristics है, but these cannot be changed, right? And it has not been changed. That was the view. And lastly, we see the communal approach. So in communal approach, we see that the Indian and the Western writers adopted aggressive and irrational approach. It was basically, this approach was aggressive and irrational to study ancient India, and they identifying it with Hinduism. So British colonialists and the historians, they were there, and um, ये लोगों को लगता था कि it is a great achievement, right? It is a great achievement, and they said that ये एक external influence है. It is attributed to the culture and external influences. So Indian histories emphasized Indian contributions to the world culture. They wanted to show that we are also in a better place. We have also contributed to the world's culture. And there was a struggle between the colonialists and the nationalists to interpret history. But then there was a change in situation. The struggle between the communalism and irrationalism versus rationalism and professionalism. This you can see very beautifully tells you about the situation कि communalism and irrationalism के बीच था versus this rationalism and professionalism. So most writers were rational and professional, right? But some have become communal and irrational. Now the irrational writers were overplaying the myths and legends, right? They argued the existence of Rama's Ayodhya without evidence. अब वो बोलने लगे कहाँ है, we need to see. हिस्ट्री तो आप कोई ऐसा नहीं है कि मन घड़त लिख सके. So we need to see the evidence also. Scientifically somebody has to prove. So actually क्या है? Is there any objectivity? वो scientific way हम use कर रहे हैं या नहीं? तो उसके बीच में there was a tussle then, right? And he said that we are ignoring the social inequities that we have, which is stressed by Manu. So communal approach में we get to see of all of these dialectical thoughts. We see that they were mostly the aggressive and irrational approaches were there, right? To identifying, and they were identifying it with Hinduism. Just like we see that attribution of painted grey ware to Vedic people has changed to Indo-Aryans, being indigenous Indians. So कैसे हम हिस्ट्री को चेंज करने लगे अब धीरे धीरे. And there was arguments also. So communalists जो थे, basically they kept arguing about various things. They said that we need to see the proofs. We need scientific and objective things to write about history. Right? So basically we see that the actual history should be based on what? This is the question जो हम last में I want you all to think upon. हिस्ट्री को बेसिकली क्या होना चाहिए? आई फील कि हिस्ट्री को थोड़ा सा अब ऑब्जेक्टिव होना चाहिए, है ना? इट शुड बी साइंटिफिक, तभी तो वी विल हैव रिलायबिलिटी एंड देयर विल बी वैलिडिटी. It should be rational also, right? That is what I feel. Please write a short note in the comment section. What do you think that history should be now? और history किस चीज़ पे अब based होना चाहिए? That was all about today's class, my friends. We will meet you in the next class. Till then, keep revising, keep preparing. Revision is the key for your success. That's what I want to tell you. आप अच्छे से उसको revise करें, पढ़ें, and see you in the next class. Thank you.